من از نهایت شب حرف میزنم، من از نهایت تاریکی و از نهایت شب حرف میزنم. اگر به خانه من آمدی برای من ای مهربان چراغ بیار و یک دریچه که از آن به ازدحام کوچه خوشبخت بنگرم. Io parlo dai confini della notte, dal termine del buio, e parlo dei confini della notte. Se vieni a casa mia, caro, portami un lume e uno spiraglio da cui puoi guardare la folla nel vicolo felice. I'm very moved by tonight because I'm very close. This book that I published recently in Italian and Persian is very close to my heart. It's the first critical edition of all of Forugh Farrokhzad's poems, بدون censure, so there is no censorship at all. And we'll talk about this, and I'll share a few thoughts about the experience of working with Farrokhzad. Even though I'm not a specialist on modern Persian literature, I started teaching myself Persian back in Italy, reading Farrokhzad's poetry. So Farrokhzad's poetry was my main gateway to the study of Persian language and literature. And then I went on to become a specialist of Hafez, Sadi, and Nizami. But now, after 15 years, the circle comes back, to its origin. And I was very lucky to be, and very honored to be entrusted with this mission of sort of reconstructing the entire corpus of Farrokhzad's collected works and translate those into my native language, which is Italian. This is the book, and it's published by Bompiani, which is one of Italy's major, most important publishers. It came out in October 2023, and after 3 weeks, it was already out of print, which is quite interesting. Poetry still sells today, even in a country like Italy. And Italians discovered non-Western poetry for the first time. And it was, it has become quite a phenomenon. I was talking to Professor Milani about the enthusiasm with which Italians and Europeans now are falling in love with Faroukh's voice and poetry. The second edition has been published this week already, so there is already a second edition in the market. It's a bilingual edition, meaning that all the Persian texts are here based on all the original editions published when Forugh was still alive. So it's based on the authorial editions approved by Farrokhzad when she was still alive, and which are very rare as editions. It's something that you cannot really easily find in libraries. And of course, in Iran, it's not published, if not through heavy censorship. I'm presenting here, the contents of the book. There is a critical introduction in which I try to explain to the Italian readers the importance of Farrokhzad's poetry and the connection between her life and art and work. And then I have all the collections. It is Asir, Divār, Osiyān or Asiyān, Tavallodi digar, Imam biavarim be agaz fasl sad. And then I decided to extract, you're all familiar with this beautiful short-filled fiction documentary, Khane Siyah Hast, The House is Black, which is extremely poetic and which contains beautiful lines of poetry that are original by Farrokhzad that have not really been studied. So I decided to extract those lines and also introduce those in the book. So they're available in Persian and Italian. There are a few poems that Farrokhzad wrote in collaboration with Yadollah Royai. I was reading a few of those with Dr. Milani earlier. Beautiful texts, and I'm glad that now they're available in Persian as well. There are a few poems that are attributed to Farrokhzad. It's not clear whether she wrote them, but they seem to be original, but it's not clear how. They surfaced at some point during the 80s and 90s in some magazines in the US mainly. And then I translated this beautiful afterword that Farrokhzad composed to defend her own right to write poetry as a woman, which appears only the first edition of Asir in 1955. And then he disappears. So it's interesting. It's something that we would talk about how he was rediscovered by Farzaneh Milani in a beautiful book on the literary biography of Farrokhzad. And then there is a final study in which I analyze, from the perspective of classical Persian literature also, the importance of Forugh Farrokhzad's poetry and her modernist style and voice. This is Poesia, is Italy's most important poetry magazine, coming out next week, and they decided to dedicate the whole edition to Forugh Farrokhzad. And they feed the title La poetessa che stravosse l'Iran, شاعری که ایران را پریشان کرد. I could translate this way. It's an article that I wrote to present the book in this magazine. So it's a testament to this new wave of interest that is happening in Italy and surrounds Persian poetry, not only Farrokhzad. Italians are used now to read Persian literature. There are many fellow translators who are very active, who are translating these days many novels, contemporary novels from Iran. Many students manage to travel to Iran, so there's a very interesting series of exchanges, despite all the political limitations, of course, and the difficulties, right, that surround the situation in Iran and the condition of women. But, with this kind of endeavors, one hopes that in the near future things might change, right? And I'm not a specialist of Forugh Farrokhzad. I'm trying to become one, hopefully, in the near future. I own most of my work and my endeavors to other scholars. Dr. Farzaneh Milani, who I mentioned her name in this beautiful book, this literary biography of Forugh Farrokhzad. I believe that is being translated into English also currently, so I can't wait for it to be out in English as well. I relied on this marvelous piece of scholarship also for my own reconstruction of Farrokhzad's biography and the connection, the intertwining between life and poetry that characterizes her life. There is this beautiful collection of essays that was reprinted, republished as a second edition a few months ago by Dominic Bruckshaw and Nasrin Rahimieh, Forugh Farrokhzad, Poet of Modern Iran. And then a classic in the field, which is Michael Hillman's biography, A Lonely Woman, which is also a very good way to understand Farrokhzad's work through her life. My approach to Farrokhzad is an approach that tried to, rewind. When I started studying Farrokhzad, I had the idea that we should not think about a poet's life and biography. We should only read the poems for what they are and take our own conclusions from that and appreciate the beauty of the text and nothing else. I had this strict structuralist, formalist approach to her poetry. And so I started translating some of the poems. I published a tiny, tiny collection when I was in my early 20s, when I just started learning Persian. Many mistakes, so I'm glad that now I could correct everything with this new edition. And I was struck by the depth of this voice and the way that this voice was capable of saying things that not even Western poets, women poets, could have said at the time, the same decade, in the 50s and 60s. So for me, after that first encounter, the question was, why is this poetry so special? What's happening? And I managed to understand the value of this poetry, the value of this boldness, only after having studied classical Persian poetry for many years. I discovered what makes Farrokhzad's poetry so exceptional and how disruptive, how radical her intervention in the tradition, the literary tradition of Iran has been. And I started looking at this specific poem titled Gonah, the sin, as in a way, the manifesto of Iranian modernism. It's the first time that a woman describes sensual desire from the perspective of a woman and talks about a man, talks to a man, a mature man, not anymore the shawhead, the young boy of the classical canon, but a mature man whom she looks at as a peer, someone, as a real interlocutor. And this happened when she was not even a teenager, she was a teenager. And she published this article, this poem in a magazine called Roshan Fakhr in 1954. There were heavy consequences, of course, after this publication. She had to pay the consequences of this, but this is what really created a completely new wave in the cultural scene of Iran, of modern Iran. I have here an English translation. If you don't mind, I read a few lines in Persian and then in Italian and then English, just to play with different languages and see how they connect to each other. I have it here. So imagine a woman in a very conservative, patriarchal society, in a literary context, in a literary tradition in which women don't really have a strong voice, not yet at the time. And if they have voice, they cannot really pronounce desire in this way. So this is the first time that something like this happens. گناه کردم گناهی پر ز لذت در آغوشی که گرم و آتشین بود گناه کردم میان بازوانی که داغ و کینه‌جوی و آهنین بود در آن خلوتگه تاریک و خاموش نگه کردم به چشم پر ز رازش دلم در سینه بی‌تابانه لرزید ز خواهش‌های چشم پر نیازش I sinned, a sin replete with pleasure in a hot embrace that set me on fire. I sinned while held by vengeful arms, resentful arms of steel ablaze. In the darkest, quietest place, I stared into the mystery of his eyes. My heart was quivering inside my chest, elated by his eyes' lustful demands. In that darkest, quietest place, I sat by him, unsettled. His lips then poured desire into my lips. My heart was freed from the craze of angst. I whispered words of love into his ears. I want you, O sweetheart. I want you, O soulful embrace. You, maddened by love, are all I want. Desire kindled flames across his gaze, scarlet wine dancing inside the cup. Amidst the softness of our bed, my limbs were drunkenly shaking atop his chest. I sinned, a sin replete with pleasure, next to a body entranced by passion. My God, how will I know what I did in the darkest, quietest place? Ho peccato, un peccato colmo di piacere. Ho peccato in un abbraccio caldo e infuocato. Ho peccato fra due braccia forti e ribollenti di rancore. In quel luogo di buio silenzio appartato, guardai nei suoi occhi colmi di segreti. Il mio cuore fremeva furioso nel petto, desiderio nei suoi sguardi vogliosi. In quel luogo di buio silenzio appartato, mi adagiai sconvolta al suo fianco. La sua bocca versava desiderio tra le mie labbra, liberandomi dal tormento del mio cuore folle. Gli sussurrai piano piano il racconto d'amore. Ti voglio, anima mia, ti voglio, abbraccio che infiamma, ti voglio, amore mio folle. Il desiderio spargeva fiamme nei suoi sguardi, il vino nero tremava e danzava nel calice, nel letto soffice le mie forme fremevano ubriache sul suo torace. Ho peccato, quanto piacere accanto allo spasimo estatico di un corpo. Oh Dio, che cosa ho mai fatto in quel luogo di buio silenzio appartato? Some scholars, some colleagues usually neglect this kind of text when studying Farrokhzad because they look at them as juvenile compositions. They're very intimate, they're very confessional. Osiyān, for instance, a whole article, a whole chapter against this poem, which he deems as one of the worst poems that Farrokhzad ever wrote. I don't agree with him, of course. I'm interested in the performance that happens through these texts. The way that Farrokhzad manages not only to change the course of the way that eroticism is shaped in the Iranian literary tradition, but she merges that eroticism with her own life experience. There is no way for us to understand where art begins and where life ends when reading Farrokhzad's poetry. And this is the first example of this interesting, beautifully clear, transparent connection between these two, in such a way that we need to think about this poetry not as just pieces of literature, but as actually performative acts. I will return to this later. And if we look at this poetry as a kind of performance, we can reconsider the entire juvenile production of Farrokhzad and understand even better now the value it had at the very early stage of her career. I'm interested in going back to the original editions because they hide these beautiful little jewels that are completely forgotten these days. The first edition of Prisoner, for instance, Asir, contained 41 poems and also 11 illustrations by a wonderful artist called Mohammad Bahrami, who is still active, I learned today, in Iran. And these is some of the images that you can see in the book. There are these illustrations that have not really been reprinted, and also show the kind of erotic imagination that was surrounding the circulation of Farrokhzad's poetry in Tehran in the mid-1950s. It's interesting to see how it was sent. This image did not appear again in the following editions of the book, which was republished in 1956 and then 1963. In my translation, in my critical edition, I tried to reconstruct all the original Persian texts from the first edition and show the differences with the following editions that were approved by Farrokhzad. So I rely on the third edition of 1963, showing, also taking all the poems that were contained in the first edition. She changed all the structure of the book. It's a fascinating story that I'm trying to retrace at this point as my own research project, to see how she was talking about her own life. She was signing and describing the place in which every single erotic encounter was happening. And so in this back and forth between Tehran and Ahvaz, where she was residing. And it's really fascinating to see that the intention behind this project and how she tried to reconstruct the narrative later on when she became already a famous poet after meeting Ibrahim Golestan. And then I consider this also an important witness of her poetics. It's a text that today we can find only in Farzaneh Milani's book. It's the foreword, it's the afterword to the 1955 edition of Asir, which I translated into Italian, is also in the book. And she says these words that resonate with us today in a new way, I think. And we should think attentively. We should be very careful when we take into account what a young poet was saying in Tehran in 1955 and compare it with the condition of women in today's Iran. She says, "For those who dismiss my poetry by saying that it conveys exclusively certain explicit erotic images, it would be better for them to study this collection of poems while holding back their judgmental stances. In terms of imagery and content, poetry can be expressed through different stylistic aspects. Each one of those can be artistically valuable by measure of the author's efforts in that specific literary aspect or mood. Should I succeed in perfecting this erotic aspect that some readers attribute to me, I'd be exceedingly satisfied still. I decided with all of my inner strength that I want to remain a woman in my poetry. I did not want to wear a mask of purity and chastity in order to hide inner features of a different kind. As Khayyam said, they say I worship wine. Yes, I do. They call me a corrupted drunkard. Yes, I am. Do not dwell on my outer appearance, for I truly am anything I hide inside. Those who want to slander me with these tactics should understand that poetry is a space that frees the artist from all external bonds. I did not devote myself to art and poetry out of amusement or folly. Poetry is my life, and what truly matters to me is the emotion of feeling alive. I do not want to surrender to the comfort of the soul and heart. My highest aspiration is to see my poetry become a manifestation of the beauty and pleasure that life can offer to human beings. I want my poetry to explode with emotion and ardor. I want to pour into the form of my poems all the excitement and enthusiasm that I feel in my life. And no one, absolutely no one, can blame me for this. A woman has the right to be a woman in her poetry too, and those who cannot accept this will have to wait for the day when, with the advancement of civilization and cultural progress, this right will be established for all Iranian women. 1955. We're at 2024. She publishes in 1956 the second collection, Divār, The Wall, and there are these beautiful images are also contained in this collection, which disappear later on. And so it's interesting to see this kind of exchange between the visual arts and literature that was happening in these very first stages of her life and her activity. Bompiani is another beautiful, beautiful poem that describes an autoerotic scene in a quite explicit way through metaphors, a beautiful natural imagery, and it's fascinating to see how this is also portrayed in the images that come with the book. We usually regard Farrokhzad's encounter with famous, film producer and writer and filmmaker Ibrahim Golestan as the turning point in her life. I think that the first turning point is her trip to Italy and Germany, which happened between 1956 and 1957, maybe early 1958. And she writes a beautiful travelogue called digar, which pre-announces the title of her most beautiful collection, Tavallodi digar. And she studies Italian and German. She spends a few weeks in Rome. She studies Italian. She visits many interesting archaeological and artistic sites. She becomes acquainted with the new wave of Italian cinema during those months. She writes beautiful pages in which she describes her encounter with the city of Rome. She traces the parallels between Rome and Tehran. It's a beautiful, beautiful reading. And then she goes to Munich, where she spends a few months with her brother, and they start translating from German. So she starts translating German modernist poetry into Persian. This is so interesting because German poetry, 19th century, early 20th century German poetry was heavily influenced by classical Persian poetry. We find the influence of Saadi and Hafez. Goethe himself was influenced by Hafez. There is a whole, up to Rilke. So it's interesting to see how Farrokhzad rediscovers aspects of her own native tradition, literary tradition, through German modernism, while trying to modernize Persian poetry, modern Persian poetry. So you can see how this circle of influences collapses into this splendid book that has not been studied as much as it should. And it's called Osiyān or Osiyān, Rebellion, which she publishes after coming back from her trip to Europe. And we see how these different literary traditions conflate in this beautiful, bold chant against the divine presence and in this constant quest for spirituality beyond religious traditions, but relying on religious traditions in order to say something completely new. And then Tavallodi digar, which is again the manifesto of Iranian poetic modernism, published in 1964. Another birth. I'll come back to Tavallodi digar. It's a stunning piece of work. Does anyone recognize these pictures? Can you tell what's happening here? What is Farrokhzad doing? Where are we? What's the context? Yes. Italian author Luigi Pirandello, 6 characters in search of an author. The Persian title is Shakhsiyat dar Justujuye Yek Nevisande, directed by Paris Saberi in Tehran in January 1964, a few months before Tavallodi Digar was published. And Pirandello, who's also Nobel Prize for literature, stages in his plays this fragmentation of the self. The self breaks apart, and there is no way to trace back the connection between the different aspects of one's personality. And time also is fragmented, is fractured, and follows the effort of the self to find its own identity without ever joining it. And Farrokhzad was surely influenced by Pirandello's ideas, and in her quest for a new identity, Farrokhzad was this constantly interested in finding the meaning of man. What am I? What am I? What is my voice? How can I belong to myself? How can I be fully myself and beyond myself at the same time? These are poignant questions that she asks constantly throughout her career, her brief but radiant career as a poet, as a total artist. We see there is painting, there is theater, there is cinema, there is documentary and poetry and short stories. She left beautifully brilliant pages of extremely lucid literary critique in which she analyzes with a very keen eye the reality of Iranian literary modernism, well beyond what Nima had done a few decades earlier. We keep discovering aspects of her poetry thanks to new details that emerge also from her biography. And that's why I always recommend to read these days Farzaneh Milani's book, because it's a wonderful way for us to reread Farrokhzad and understand that the confessional side of her poetry is something that is much more than pure confession, but is a constant work on selfhood and self-analysis. There is this beautiful poem called Gole Sorkh. We discovered only a few years ago, after the publication of Milani's book, that it was composed after Farrokhzad discovered to be pregnant, and unfortunately she decided to interrupt pregnancy. And there are extremely painful pages in which Ibrahim Golestan describes this decision that she made. And interesting thing is that this poem was censored even before 1979. So the version with which we're familiar, that is published both in Iran and in the West, mainly in Germany or in Sweden, is not what was published in the original edition of Tavallodi Digar. So I was so happy to find the original book and see how strong these images are. Right? I read only the English translation. Scarlet rose, scarlet rose, scarlet rose, Gole Sorkh, Gole Sorkh, Gole Sorkh. He took me there to the scarlet rose garden. In the dark, he put a scarlet rose in my anxious hair, and in the end, he slept with me upon the petal of a scarlet rose. O paralyzed doves, O trees set free from menopause, O blind windows, now beneath my heart, in the depths of my loins, a scarlet rose is sprouting. A scarlet rose, scarlet, like a stain of blood. Oh, and I am so pregnant, pregnant, pregnant. So there is a philological work that can be done in order to rediscover the openness of this text and how Farrokhzad was constantly changing and editing her own poems. And it shows this constant fluidity of her approach to the arts. And we see how, this is another poem that also is extremely interesting, that in different magazines, it was published in different magazines before coming out in Tavallodi Digar. And I read it in Italian because I'm very attached to it. Be aftab salami dobare khaham dad. Saluterò di nuovo il sole. Saluterò di nuovo il sole e il torrente che mi scorreva in petto. Saluterò le nuvole dei miei pensieri cadenzati e la crescita dolorosa dei pioppi in giardino, che percorrevano con me le stagioni più aride. Saluterò poi gli stormi di corvi che a sera mi portavano in offerta l'odore dei campi notturni. Saluterò mia madre, che viveva in uno specchio come ritratto dalla mia vecchiaia. E saluterò la terra, il suo desiderio ardente di ripetermi e riempire di semi verdi il suo ventre infiammato. Sì, la saluterò di nuovo. Arrivo, con i capelli miei, procedere di odori dal terreno, e questi miei occhi, esperienze dense del buio. Io arrivo con gli arbusti che recisi nei boschi oltre il muro. Arrivo, e la soglia trabocca d'amore, mentre aspetto quelli che amano. E la ragazza che è ancora lì, nella soglia traboccante d'amore, io lei la saluterò di nuovo. I'll greet again the sunshine and the river that ran inside my chest. I'll greet the clouds of my rhythmic thoughts and the painful growth of poplars in the garden, which crossed with me all arid seasons. I'll greet again the flocks of crows that brought me scents of fields and night. I'll greet my mother, who lived in a mirror and was the countenance of my old age to come. I'll greet the earth, its desire full of lust, to bring me back and fill its ardent bosom with verdant seeds. Yes, I'll greet the earth, I'll greet her again. And here I come, with my hair, this earthy smell from the underground, and my eyes, this dense experience of darkness. Here I come with shrubs I picked from woods beyond the wall. Here I come, and this threshold teems with love. And from this threshold I will greet again all those who love, and that girl who stands there still, by the threshold that teems with love, that girl, yes, I will greet her again. Now, we usually think about translation as a transfer, right, from one language to another, and trying to bring to a broader audience in the target language the contents, right, and the forms of the original language. More the content than the forms. I believe, though, that what translation does is much more than this simple transfer from one language to another. What translation can do is to rediscover the meanings that are found in the original text from a different angle that brings with itself the magnifying power of another culture. So when we put things together, usually, we discover things that we were not aware of when just looking at the original. Right? So I really believe in the power that translation has to unearth new ways to look at text with which we're already familiar, because we can access that language. And so for me, translating this book was an excuse to rediscover my own literary tradition in Italy, and to think about the meaning of Farrokhzad in Italian. And I was moved by the fact also that Farrokhzad herself was so much in love with Italy and Italian culture, and so finding connections between her and different aspects of Italian modernist poetry was a great opportunity to re-study, reread Farrokhzad and find new ways of understanding her work. So I looked at 4 different authors, mostly women, one man, and I tried to see how their voice in Italian could resonate with what Farrokhzad does in Persian. In order to, there's this interesting French philosopher and theorist of translation, Henri Mechonic. He says that translators should not translate what a text says. Translators should translate what a text does. What is the impact of a text? How can we reproduce that impact rather than just thinking about the meaning of the original, which is also important, of course. So I looked at Antonia Pozzi, 1912, 1938, Pierpaolo Pasolini, whom Farrokhzad met in Rome, by the way, great filmmaker as well and poet, 1922-75, Cristina Campo, 1923-77, and Maria Rosselli, 1930-1996. All these people died in very tragic ways. So there is also this interesting point of contact between their lives, their biographies, and Forugh Farrokhzad, who died at 32 in a car crash in Tehran, unfortunately. So I call this an exercise in comparative criticism, and I have a few points that I would like to underline and share with you. How can we think about Farrokhzad as a global modernist poet? I remember that when I presented this book in Toronto last month, one of our friends asked me, do you think that Farrokhzad was aware of the fact that her poetry would become a global phenomenon? I don't think she was, but she became one. So it's fascinating, you know, to think how translation can modify the yield and the framework in which, you know, a specific body of work can find new life, right, through different languages. We can think of Persian literature through Farrokhzad as a transnational Eurasian trend. I always think of Persian literature not as an Iranian phenomenon. I look at it as a trans-Eurasian, trans-global phenomenon since the very ancient times. And Persian literature has never been something that belongs only to the cultural framework of Iran. It's something that embraces all of Eurasia in different ways, with different religions, different linguistic traditions. So it's a global language since the very beginning of the tradition. And Farrokhzad belongs to this transnational movement, even though she was not really interested in being translated that much, as far as we know. But she was already producing poetry that belonged to an international framework. By reinventing also the lyric canon, the experience of lyric poetry, and merging it, letting it merge with other traditions, so recreating the literary past of Iran. So she was imitating other authors, and at the same time she was criticizing very, very strongly the classical form of Persian poetry. This idea of confessionalism and as performance, I don't look at other female poets when I think about Farrokhzad. I look at performance artists. I look at photographers. I look at people who use their own bodies as a channel to express their art beyond what words can do. And that's why I think in terms of visual artists to understand the non-visual aspect of Farrokhzad's poetry. She had a question. Her question for Farrokhzad was, is it possible for a woman to write poetry? Can a woman describe desire as it is without censoring herself? And if the answer is yes, how can a woman do this when there is no language to express desire from the perspective of women? Right? The entire tradition of Persian eroticism, starting from Rudaki, starting from Daghighi, the first fragments of erotic poetry. When I say erotic, I mean lyric poetry about love, poetry about desire, is written by men describing, in most cases, other men of a different generation, younger men probably, right? The Shohed. Farrokhzad needs to change the language by experiencing desire through her own skin. So for her, the quest for sensual experiences becomes, at a very early age, a way for her to reinvent the language of eroticism in Persian. And this is outstanding. This is something that there are no real examples in other cultural literary traditions in which experience becomes the main point of access to change the language that it does not contain, does not have the images to describe this kind of desire, flipping the gender and flipping the direction of desiring subject and desired object. So this is why performance studies, the experience of performance artists, the experience of photographers who showed the world of desire and the consequences of desire, in many cases very negative, on their own skin, like Nan Goldin, for instance, who is a wonderful, wonderful photographer, Cindy Sherman also, are, I think, an interesting point of comparison to understand, especially the early stage of Farrokhzad's poetry, instead of dismissing it as, just simple, juvenile experiences that don't deserve to be studied, right? So this is where I'm at now. For the question of eroticism, we know that medieval Persian poetry, classical Persian poetry, is mostly homoerotic. There's usually a male desiring subject who desires a younger man. So there is a same. So it's normative. There is a famous, not very famous, she's becoming famous now, poet named Jahan Malek Khatun, who flourished in Shiraz in the 14th century, in the same city where Hafez was becoming famous in the same period. So they probably knew each other. And she also writes a beautiful introduction to her own poetry. I'm comparing now her introduction to Farrokhzad's afterword. And she decides to embrace the homoerotic canon. She writes poems, she writes ghazals in which she pretends to be an older man in love with a young boy, right? So to show that homoeroticism in that tradition is normative. Farrokhzad's poetry is heterosexual, is not homosexual, but is non-normative because she goes against the norm of seeing the female presence as an object. And she turns that female object into a subject who can desire, who can express desire. There's this famous poem, Ma'shuq Man, right? My Beloved, in which she dedicated to, of course, describing most likely Ibrahim Golestan. She uses the word Ma'shuq, which in Persian, classical Persian, refers to a younger boy or to a woman who has no agency, usually, right? In the classical canon, it's just a passive, idealized object of desire. And she transforms that word, Ma'shuq, into a word that describes a man, a mature man, that stands in front of her, and which she describes as a poor thing, like the movie, right? That she can hold in the forest, in the wild forest of her breasts, if you remember the last lines of that poem, Ma'shuq Man. This is extraordinary. This is the first time it happens. So this is why I see the problem of gender is also an interesting point of contact with what was happening in different ways in other countries. But what Farrokhzad does here is it's something that is unique and which has not been studied yet the way it should be, I think. And especially the idea that even within the heterosexual conversation, the heterosexual discourse, there is this element of disruption, of non-normativity that is very unique about her. The question of mysticism, I don't think we have much time to talk about it. Maybe during the Q&A I can go to that. What does it mean to think about religion, and what does it mean to embrace mysticism through an experience that does not seem Islamic, but is influenced by other religions, mainly Christianity and Judaism. The way she rereads Omar Khayyam, it's all very fascinating. She reads, in an interview, there's this long Masnavi that she writes called Ashegane, in which she influenced by Masnavi Ma'navi, by Molana. And even though you don't really see it when you read Ashegane, in the interview, she reveals this connection that is not immediately clear when you read the poem. I'm going to share a few poems by these authors I was looking at when translating, when finding my Italian voice to connect with Farrokhzad, and reread her personality through these faces and these images, these words. So I'm curious to see how this resonates with all of you. And this is an invitation for you to discover how Italian literature can connect with Persian. Antonia Pozzi, similar story. She committed suicide. It was not a car crash, but she suffered from unrequited love in northern Italy, in Milan, and she describes the feeling of things when they're about to end. So there's this twilight line of poetry is described in Italian tradition. And I show these lines from a poem called Noon that showcase interesting parallels with Farrokhzad's style. In this golden sunlight, I am a fuzzy flower bud, cruelly tied with a piece of twine so I can't open to bathe in light. Next to me you are a calming freshness of grass in which I'd like to sink madly and dissolve myself in an intoxicating tangle of green, to cast into subtle roots my sharpest pangs and become a part of the earth. This idea of going to the root of things, of feeling desire and the impossibility of desire is something that is intoxicating and affects the entire body of the poet. This is Antonia Pozzi. Amelia Rosselli stands at the other side of the spectrum. She's a radical experimentalist. She also committed suicide in 1996. She's a very fine knower of metrics and prosody, el mearuz in Italian, and she plays with that. And I used her poetry to think about Farrokhzad's own experimentalism when it comes to aruz, when it comes to prosody, right? The way that Farrokhzad plays with these very long meters, very long lines. And if you ever heard Farrokhzad reciting her own poetry, she has this interesting way of relying on her breath to keep going even when she's out of breath. And she keeps reading and sort of testing the boundaries and the power of the Persian meters in a completely new way. This is what Amelia Rosselli does, in a way. And so I looked at her cerebral, in a way, poetry to think about that later phase of Farrokhzad's production. There's something like pain in the room. There is something like pain in the room, and it's partly overcome, but the weight of objects wins, the way of signifying weight and loss. There's something like red in the tree, but it's the orange of the lampstand, bought in places I don't want to remember because they too carry weight. Since I can know nothing of you hunger, the stylized fountains are precise in their desire, a destiny of people separated by oblique noise, can, when overturned, fail into place quite well. I see here the very, very last phase of Farrokhzad's poetry, the last poems of Imam Biawarim Oghaze Fasl Sard, for instance, or the poems that she wrote with Yadullah Royai, in which there is this cerebral approach to what can we do with the meter? What can we do with a form of poetry that goes well beyond the expectations of the reader? And finally, one of the most unique intellectuals of 20th century Italy, Pierpaolo Pasolini, who is famous mostly for his films, for his movies. He influenced Forugh Farrokhzad. Probably they influenced each other in different ways when they met in Rome in the early 1960s. Pasolini was the first sort of outspoken homosexual poet in Italy. And I look at homoerotic Italian poetry to capture the impact that Farrokhzad's heterosexual poetry had in Tehran in the 50s. It's very hard to describe, right, today, even for non-Iranian, even for Iranian audiences, the impact that Farrokhzad's eroticism had in the 1950s, publishing things such as Gona, for instance. So in order to render, to imagine, to think about that impact, I try to look at the way that homosexual Italian poets in 1960s and 70s were for the first time talking about desire for other men in a culture that was absolutely not ready to accept any of that, absolutely. Pasolini is one of these examples. So it's interesting to see how they also met. And we don't know what kind of changes they have, but I'm curious to see how far we can go with these comparisons. So this is the last piece I will read. This is a poem that he dedicated to his muse, this Nenetto Davoli, who is his beloved and also actor in many of Pasolini's movies. Pasolini also filmed a movie in Iran. There are beautiful scenes from Esfahan in Il fiore delle milioni notte, The Flower of 1001 Nights. And here we will recognize how unrequited love, the impossibility of desire, is there in a way that sounds like what Farrokhzad describes when trying to talk about her own heterosexual desire when she was very young. After much weeping in secret and in front of you, after having staged many acts of desperation, you made the final decision to surrender and never to be seen again. I am done. I have acted like a madman. I will not let the water run from the source of my evil and my good. These pacts between men are not for you. Or perhaps you're too skilled in the art of breaking them, guided by Jenny that gives you certainty by which you're transfigured. You know the right button to push. When I speak, you tell me no, and I tremble with disgust and fury at the thought of our unforgettable happy hours. Rome, January 13, 1972. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions. I think the floor is open for comments, questions. I'd be happy to. I think this.
Thank you. This was beautiful. She died so young, but how did you see the arc of her exploration of desire transform her in her works?
Very good question. I think the Farrokhzad had a very strong proto-feminist agenda at the very beginning. And then, for instance, she writes that afterward, right? After Asir. And then she takes it out. She discovers that desire and the explicit expression of desire is something that can be expressed in a way that is less direct. This is fascinating. She discovers how to make art beyond the explicit style that she has in the very first poems. There is this she also starts thinking about herself as a non-gendered presence. So the idea of being a woman is not very relevant anymore toward the end of her life. So she thinks about desire as a broader universal sensation that also gets closer to mysticism in a way, I think. And then she writes with Royai, she writes these extremely erotic, explicit, almost pornographic poems that dig into the experience of the body in a way that confuses the boundary between the masculine and the feminine. So it's a very interesting arc, and it happened only in 10 years. This is fascinating.
How old was she in the first poem?
She was 18, 19 when, yes, yeah. So there's that. And she's very critical of pop art and the sort of the spectacle of the body that happens in Tehran in the early 60s. She criticized Mahvash, for instance, for being too explicit and too vulgar. She has lines, I think, in which she makes fun of Mahvash and says people only think about Mahvash and Ghormeh Sabzi. She writes in one of her diaries. And, I love Ghormeh Sabzi and Mahvash as well. But so there is this idea that, right, there is this quest for emancipation of the female presence, but at the same time, she has this elitist approach at some point, saying that we don't want to see naked bodies on magazines, and right. And it's interesting to look at these questions also from the perspective of what happens in Iran today, right? The quest for freedom, and we do want women to be free to expose themselves, right, in public, but at the same time, there is this cultural critique from the 50s that makes the conversation much more complex, much more nuanced, I think. And Farrokhzad has a great role for us to understand the different boundaries of this kind of conversations.
I think that her exploration of eroticism went towards mysticism rather than the trajectory that she sort of started on.
She fell in love, madly in love. The letters that she wrote to Golestan, which we can read, and I'm embarrassed to say that I love reading them, but they're pieces of literature, right? After all these decades, but they're I've never seen anything like this. So the expression of pure radical love that I don't think that the human body can experience that love without thinking of another dimension of going to another side of of human experience, I think. Even though she was not necessarily religious, she didn't really compose religious poetry, strictly speaking, but it was a different kind of spirituality that, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was just wondering that how did she manage to learn German in such a short period of time to translate German poetry to Persian poetry? And the other thing, because these names that you mentioned, with the exception of Pasolini, I don't think the dates match that they had any access to Farrokhzad's poetry. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll start from this. No, this is only for me to find correspondences.
Oh, okay.
They never met. No, absolutely. They were not aware, no. She was not fluent in German. She studied German, but her brother was helping her. So they were translating. Nima Mina wrote an interesting article about this, about how Farrokhzad managed, with the help of her brother, to translate some Persian poetry. So they were creating together some word-by-word translation, then she would reinvent those. And they published a collection of her poems in Persian and German about 20 years ago, called Marge Man Ruzi. It was published in Germany, I think. And, yeah, so it's really interesting. So,
Did she know German yet?
she could understand a bit, but no, she never really learned the language. She studied it and then worked with her brother on these translations. It was a work that they did together. Yes. No, not Feridun. No. Feridun. Yes, Feridun. Okay. Yes.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. So my question is, you made a very interesting connection between performance art and how you compare performance artists with the work of Forugh Farrokhzad, actually. And you brought up Sidney Sherman's, for example, performative photography about the female body and how she had agency over her own body by being the photographer and at the same time the subject of her own photography. So, and I wonder, but it happened later on, after the death of the Farrokhzad, but I wonder if she was influenced by the earlier feminist movement happening in Europe, because she was in Germany, she visited Italy. So I wonder if she was influenced by this global feminist movement happening much earlier. Because the issue of having agency over your own body is something very interesting that you mentioned. And for the first time, she wants to have that agency and she doesn't want to be the object of desire anymore. So she changes the whole dynamic of the eroticism and erotic action in Persian classical poetry. Although the beloved is always ambiguous in classical Persian poetry, we don't know if the beloved one in Persian classical poetry is a woman or is a man. So there is this ambiguity about the beloved one. The majority of time, yes, it's been a male beloved, but it's ambiguous, at least we can live with that. But so, yeah, I just wonder if she has been influenced by, because we do not have any example earlier than Forugh in Iran, in Tehran, in modern era.
I think Parveen Ehtesami. I think Parveen Ehtesami has, at least the theoretical part is there. I think that in Parveen Ehtesami there is already a social activism that is not translated into personal experience. It's not, of course, her life was completely different from Faroukh's. But for instance, she has this Qasideh in which she talks about, she celebrates the decision of the Shah of forbidding the veil, right? The chador is forbidden, and she writes these disparaging lines against the chador, so it's there, but it's more of a social political activism rather than real personal investment. I don't know. I don't know how. It's a good question. It's worthwhile, studying how Western currents. But what she was doing was more radical than what feminists were doing in Europe at the same time, or at a personal level. publishing that kind of poetry. That's why I bring up the, Italian or German homosexual poetry, because it was as radical as that, which happened even 10 or 20 years later than her. So it's a unique thing, and it happened such an early stage that I don't think she was really exposed to the real conversation happening. But I do think that it's worthwhile exploring how Parveen Tesami influenced her from this point of view. Absolutely. And then about the gender in classical poetry, we could talk about it for hours. It's a very interesting, it's a fascinating question, right? I think that gender comes with the genre. The Masnavi genre is more heteronormative. The Ghazal genre is based on the idea of the otherness, the Turkic male presence, the ghulam. It goes all the back to the Central Age, but it's a complex question, absolutely. No, it's much more nuanced than that, absolutely. Thank you for that. Please.
I want to actually talk about what you talked about, the inspiration and reinventing this language of a woman talking about love to a man. We actually have, we usually talk about Rudaki as the first poet, but then at the same time we have the first woman poet who was living at the same time of Rudaki, Rabia Balkhi. And her poetry was again expressing the love of woman to men. Do you think that had any impact on Ruth's, language?
We have Rabbi Balkhi, we have Mahsati Ganjavi.
Yeah.
These are, from a philological point of view, it seems that there's no real textual tradition there supporting. It's more like narratives. It's more sort of narratives, the scattered lines, and then fictitious reconstructions of biographies that François de Blois, in his bibliographical survey of classical Persian poetry, writes about Rabbi Balkhi and Mahsati Ganjavi, demonstrates that probably they never wrote anything. So that's an interesting, right. Khayyam also, according to de Blois, never wrote a single rubai, but that's another question. But so I think that the first woman who really left an impact, in a way, was Jahan, but it's already in the Mongol period. In the Mongol period, there was a much more open approach to women. I think in Iranian society there was But before that, it's mixed of legend and fictitious narratives, and it's worth exploring, of course. But there's nothing that is so powerful, really. Please.
At the beginning, you mentioned that there's a school of thought for translating a piece. Is not necessarily the translation of the text, but how it makes you feel. Wouldn't that run the risk of, doing something different? Three people read one piece and they might feel
three different feelings, of course.
This is the original intention of the author. I'd like to hear.
Yes, no, it's a fascinating question because, of course, right, a poem can have an impact in Tehran in 1955. It can have a different impact in Tehran today. It can have a different impact in Tehran Jeles, where I live. No, it's a matter of understanding how the culture surrounding the text works, how a specific poem was received at the same time during the same period, and how it's received today. I don't really appreciate translations from medieval Persian poetry that try to mimic rhyme and meter, making something that is very anachronistic in English today. I prefer translations that are a bit more audacious in sort of measuring themselves with what happens in English poetry today, right? And finding some sort of a balance between the two aspects, right? So yeah, it's always it's a never-ending work, right? Just you never. But I think that idea of translating line by line, word by word, destroys the original text because it's not poetry, right? It's not. It's just you convey the meaning, but you don't convey the effect, all of that. And then on the effect, of course, we have so many questions around that. So, yes.
You mentioned that she was critical of like how women were depicted in mass media and other forms at the time. I'm wondering like why do you think that is, and who she was critical of, and where I can find this criticism?
She was critical of the extreme rapid modernization of Iran, especially Tehran. And she knew that, she was one of the first environmentalists of Iran. She talked about, what's happening to nature in Iran. She talked about, what the symbol of the garden is, the garden is falling apart, the garden is sick, the garden is coughing, the garden cannot. And then she has this beautiful long poem that was very fun to translate called Ey Marz por Gohar. And it's a very sharp satire of this process of modernization of Tehran, mainly. She describes also how there is no water in the Zayan Derud. She calls it Zenderud, which is not Zend anymore. She has all sorts of puns about that, about the river of Isfahan. So I would look at the Tavallodi digar and the poems that you can find in Tavallodi digar, which are translated into English. Elizabeth Gray has good translations. Sholeh Wolpe also has good translations. I'm working ideally on an English translation of all the collected poems at some point. We'll see if I can do it. But you can also find, if you read Persian, she has interesting inner critical, in literary critique, pages of literary critique or interviews. I can share with you some references in which they have not been translated though. So it's really interesting.
Thank you. That was really lovely.
Thank you.
Your discussion on the creation of a new language to describe desire going against norms reminded me of a couple of things from the Francophone tradition. First, the decadence movement of like a century ago, and there was a push to, in particular because French is so gendered, to recreate and reimagine the description of female desire and female pleasure and female orgasm and all these things because the words were so masculine, quite literally. I'm curious if there's something similar in Italian, or if there was a similar movement in Italian sort of feminist literature or poetry. And then I'm also reminded of Hélène Cixous, like decades later, and her push for feminine writing to recreate the language that's needed to describe our own realities without the confines of like patriarchal norms. Yeah.
Italy is a very conservative country, so it's extremely conservative still today. No, it's something that is not. So it's interesting translating that effect in a culture in which it never happened. We never had real feminist poetry in Italy. Still today, it's not there. We had gay poetry first, but not feminist poetry in a way that is, as you describe in the French tradition, in German tradition as well.
I guess I'm also wondering about the because Italian is also gendered in nouns and articles in a way that Persian isn't, but French and German are, and there have been grapplings with that. Has there been any of that in like homosexual poetry or like queer poetry that has grappled with gender in the tradition, like a homonormative tradition of poetry?
Yes. There is. It's more about the description of what the erotic lyricism would never touch or would never disclose, and sort of playing also with the fluidity of gender. This is something that it's very common in Pasolini, but it could have been a great opportunity for Italian feminism but Italian feminism was not interested in poetry. This is an interesting thing. Poetry was not. It was a very communist approach of saying we cannot work on we need to work on the structure. We don't care about the cultural production because cultural productions are already part of that structure that needs to be modified and destroyed from the foundations. So there is this is interesting. No, it's interesting. She was influenced by French literature but she only mentions names of male authors. André Gide, Proust, Baudelaire.
I mean, I doubt like Rashid, Marquis de Sade would make it all the way to Iran and
No, it was translated. There was, yes. There were translation.
With the female desire or feminine expressions of desire mostly happens in La Jongleuse, because her other two books are mostly written about a male protagonist and from his point of view. That one, I can't even find a translation in English. There's only one that I could find.
The things that were being translated in Tehran in the 1940s, 30s, 40s, and 50s it's unbelievable. One could spend an entire life in the archives, right? A bus and that's it's a whole another chapter of the history of Iran in the 20th century. All the impact of the translations that are not really circulating anymore, but it was a whole movement, and we will see what we can find.
So what I learned, you referenced a part of the Faroukh's the type that she expressed, the forbidden love, was coming from her experience meeting the people, like in Italy you mentioned that like the homosexualism, which is a forbidden love in that country. So she got the idea how she can just convert it to her own way of expressing her own forbidden love. And you mentioned the gonah. As far as I know, with my limited knowledge, very limited knowledge compared to you and the other audiences, the gonah is coming from one of the very first poems she just published, even before her divorce.
Yes.
So,
Roshan Fekh, 1954.
Right, and at that time, she hasn't been even gone to any foreign countries. She just moved from Tehran to south of Iran, living with her first husband, I mean the first and the only husband, and then she published that poem, and that became a big problem for her, being like criticized that, you know, what this poem is coming from. Is it an affair story or is it from your imagination? And you know the story. So I'm thinking about how she could get influence at that time, at that age, which she hasn't gone anywhere. She hasn't met anyone in Italy or anyone. She hasn't met even Golestan. You know, she was very young, and then she just all of a sudden come with very radical way of expressing herself. How, based on your research, you know, how would you, explain that?
I think here is the contrast between Ahvaz and Tehran. And Tehran seen as, even though she grew up in Mazandaran, and then from Mazandaran they went to Tehran, right? But she experienced Tehran for the first time as a young adult when she was traveling from Ahvaz to meet publishers and editors in Tehran. She calls Tehran Shahr Nurha, right? There's this idea, a ville lumière, that is Tehran for her, that is, and I see that erotic kind of quest for experience as part that is connected to the editorial world of Tehran, and the idea of having intellectual exchanges with the cultural elites of modernists, all the Nimaic poets and writers who were active in Tehran, and she could have. So it's through language, I think. It's through the exercise of critical language in the exploration of the editorial world of Tehran in the mid-50s that opened, these possibilities of erotic exploration that could not happen in Ahvaz, of course. And she decides to describe that. She writes at the end of every poem in Asir the city in which the poem was composed. So she creates these micro-narratives. She really wanted to be even more open about what was happening in that. And for Gonah, I think it was Khodayar, right? Khodayar was the publisher of Roshan Fekh, the editor of Roshan Fekh, who then outed her with a short story in which readers understood that the protagonists were Khodayar and Farrokhzad. It was probably in response to a short story that Farrokhzad herself had published, in which she was describing him and critiquing him. It's very convoluted, but it's part of the. It's not just lustful quest for sex. I think it's more about what kind of intellectual exchanges can create a new world for me that reflects the kind of cultural impulses that they cannot be satisfied in Ahvaz, where I live with my family, with my husband and my child. So Tehran meant that. So it's a literary experience first and foremost that becomes a sexual experience as well. But it happens, in the arc of 2 or 3 years. It's so radical and with very heavy psychological consequences. She was inflicted the physical humiliation of electroshock right when she was recovered after attempting her first suicide attempt, right before after divorcing from her husband. So yeah, and I think that her trip to Europe, we don't really see the eroticism there. It's interesting, right? When she meets finally the other culture, the eroticism fades away. It's not really important anymore. It starts becoming a conversation about the quest for God, a God that is not the God of the sacred scriptures, but is a God who should be capable of understanding the spiritual independence of humankind. And so it's interesting, that eroticism is not a thing anymore after she goes to Europe. Thank you.